When the world looked toward the United Nations Security Council chamber in New York, what they saw was more than a diplomatic disagreement. They saw a warning. They saw empty chairs. 14 nations walked out during the United States presentation on Iran, and they did not do it quietly. They did not wait for the speech to end. They did not offer polite excuses. They stood up, gathered their papers, pushed back their chairs, and walked out while the American ambassador was still speaking. The scraping of chairs against the chamber floor became the sound of America's diplomatic isolation playing out in real time. Cameras captured the moment from every angle. Diplomats from France, Germany, Japan, and South Korea leaving the room was not just symbolic theater. It was a public statement. It was the world signaling that something fundamental had broken, and only minutes later, Iran's foreign minister stepped in front of cameras outside that same chamber and delivered 3 words that hit Washington harder than any missile could. We reject everything. Not, we need more time. Not, we are considering the proposal. Not, we are open to further discussions. Just 3 words. We reject everything. With that statement, Iran made it clear that it would not accept a ceasefire on America's terms, would not negotiate under pressure, and would not play the role Washington expected it to play. For the White House, this was not just a diplomatic setback. It was a public humiliation. Donald Trump had promised that Iran would be brought to its knees within 72 hours. He had sold this strategy as fast, brilliant, and decisive. But now, 6 weeks later, not only had Iran refused to surrender, America's own allies were openly breaking ranks in front of the entire world. This is the story of how that happened. This is the story of how a strategy built on speed, pressure, and shock began to unravel. It is the story of how military confidence turned into diplomatic isolation, how bold promises turned into global embarrassment, and how a president who promised total control ended up watching events slip further and further out of his hands. Because what happened at the United Nations was not a random outburst. It was the result of weeks of miscalculations, ignored warnings, rising tensions, and one dangerous assumption at the heart of the administration's plan: that Iran would break before America's alliances did. 42 days earlier, Trump stood in the Rose Garden and announced what he called one of the most brilliant military strategies in modern American history. The idea, according to his administration, was simple: strike fast, strike hard, apply overwhelming pressure, then force Iran into surrender before the world had time to react. The strategy had 3 clear phases. First, simultaneous military strikes on key Iranian command centers. Second, an economic chokehold through a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important shipping routes on Earth. Third, back-channel diplomacy in which Iran, weakened and cornered, would accept American terms because it had no other option left. On paper, to Trump and his advisors, it sounded perfect. It was the kind of strategy that fit his political style: dramatic, aggressive, fast-moving, and easy to sell to the public as strength. Congressional leaders were reportedly told the operation could be over within 7 to 10 days. Trump went on television and told audiences that Iran would be begging for a deal by the weekend. No long war, no boots on the ground, no major blowback, just a powerful show of American force, followed by a quick surrender. But from the very beginning, there was one massive problem. The strategy depended on Iran behaving the way Washington wanted it to behave. It depended on Iran panicking. It depended on Iran seeing the pressure and immediately deciding that survival required surrender. It also depended on America's allies going along with the plan, even if they had serious doubts about it. And those doubts were there from the start. European governments warned that taking military action without broad international support would damage NATO unity. Japan and South Korea warned that blocking Hormuz would devastate their economies and energy supplies. Gulf state partners signaled privately that they were not interested in being used as staging grounds for a regime change campaign. But those warnings were brushed aside. The administration believed that once Iran started collapsing, everyone else would fall in line. That assumption now looks like the original sin of the entire operation. Because Iran did not collapse, it adapted. It absorbed the blows. It held its political leadership together. Its military remained operational. And instead of giving the White House the quick surrender it expected, Iran began turning time itself into a weapon. The longer the conflict dragged on, the more pressure would shift onto Washington. The longer the blockade remained in place, the more global markets would panic. The longer America's allies were forced to pay the price for a conflict they did not choose, the more likely they were to rebel against it. Iran understood that it did not need to win quickly. It just needed to outlast the fantasy of quick American victory. That became brutally clear on the morning the diplomatic dominoes began to fall. Early Monday, Trump reportedly received a short phone call from the French president. It was not a negotiation. It was not a request. It was a notice. France was withdrawing from joint military operations related to Iran and would support a United Nations resolution condemning the blockade of Hormuz. That one call was a shock. But before the White House could even process it, Germany was issuing a similar break. Then Japan announced it would redirect energy imports away from the Persian Gulf permanently, signaling a deeper loss of trust in America's ability to stabilize the region. Suddenly, this was not just about Iran anymore. It was about allies recalculating their entire relationship with American leadership, and financial markets noticed immediately. The stock market opened sharply down. Investors were not reacting only to military tension. They were reacting to something deeper and more dangerous. The idea that American credibility itself had become unstable. Analysts started describing diplomatic isolation as a market risk. That is an extraordinary phrase because it means global investors were no longer treating America as the steady center of the international system. They were treating it as a source of volatility. Once that perception takes hold, the damage spreads far beyond one crisis. It starts affecting energy prices, shipping costs, inflation expectations, consumer confidence, and long-term investment decisions. At the same time, Trump was reportedly on calls with regional leaders, trying to hold the coalition together. One of the most important calls was with the Saudi Crown Prince. According to the account described in the source material, the Crown Prince made it clear that Saudi Arabia could not support further escalation and was already exploring ways to reopen regional dialogue. That message was devastating because it signaled that even America's traditional Middle Eastern partners were trying to create distance from the White House strategy. Trump's approach had been built on the idea that overwhelming force would create alignment. Instead, it was creating separation. The harder he pushed, the more people stepped back. Then came the media moment that turned a bad situation into a global narrative disaster. Iran's foreign minister appeared across multiple major international networks and delivered a calm, disciplined, carefully framed statement. That mattered. He was not ranting. He was not emotional. He was not threatening wild retaliation. He was presenting Iran as reasonable, patient, and firm. He claimed the United States had already floated ceasefire offers several times, but attached conditions that would effectively force Iran to surrender sovereignty. He accused Washington of leaking optimistic stories to the media to make itself look strong, while no real agreement existed. Then he pointed directly to the UN walkout as evidence that the world was no longer buying the American version of events. That was the genius of the statement from Iran's perspective. It reframed the conflict. Instead of Iran appearing isolated and desperate, the White House now looked isolated and desperate. Instead of Iran being seen as the side that needed a ceasefire, America became the side struggling to build support for one. Instead of Washington controlling the narrative, Tehran suddenly appeared to understand the global mood more clearly than Washington did. And when the foreign minister said, in effect, that the American peace offer was really an act of desperation, that line landed because the optics supported it. The room at the UN had literally emptied out behind the American case. That night, according to the script you provided, a high-level crisis meeting took place in the White House Situation Room. And this is where the political theater gave way to hard reality. The military assessment was sobering. The blockade could not be sustained indefinitely without serious logistical strain. Iran's retaliatory capabilities were increasing. American assets had been damaged. Service members had been killed. Regional bases thought to be secure had come under attack. This was no longer a pressure campaign moving cleanly toward victory. It was becoming a prolonged confrontation with rising costs and no clean exit. Inside that room, the core disagreement came into focus. Some voices reportedly argued that the answer was to double down, to maintain pressure, to intensify the strategy until Iran finally cracked. Others warned that the diplomatic environment had changed so dramatically that the military plan could no longer be separated from the political fallout. This is one of the most important truths in international conflict. Military force does not exist in a vacuum. It depends on alliances, legitimacy, economic resilience, legal justification, and domestic political support. Once those begin to erode, even a powerful military campaign can become strategically weaker. That is exactly what seems to have happened here. Trump reportedly wanted a simple answer: are we winning or not? But wars and crises rarely give simple answers. A country can be militarily superior and still be strategically losing. A president can look strong in rhetoric while becoming weaker in practice. A blockade can create pressure on an adversary while also destabilizing the countries needed to support the policy. What the administration appeared to confront in that room was not just resistance from Iran, but the collapse of the story they had been telling themselves about how this was supposed to work. And once that story collapses, everything starts changing. Iran no longer sees an unstoppable coalition. America's allies no longer see a confident strategy they can trust. Markets no longer assume that Washington knows where this is going. Congress no longer sees a limited operation with predictable boundaries. The president's own political allies begin to sense danger. And that is when a foreign policy challenge becomes a much broader leadership crisis. The domestic political consequences are impossible to ignore. If a president launches a major military confrontation and promises quick success, every day without success becomes political damage. Every spike in gas prices becomes part of the argument against him. Every market drop becomes part of the argument against him. Every sign of allied disunity becomes part of the argument against him. If voters begin to associate the conflict with inflation, instability, and international embarrassment, support erodes fast. That matters even more in an election cycle, when lawmakers begin protecting themselves rather than the White House. This is why the script's references to Republican discomfort are so important to the broader story. When even normally loyal voices begin to use cautious language, that is often a sign that political risk is rising. Public statements about needing to reassess strategy or consult military experts may sound mild, but in Washington, they often signal distance. They mean people are preparing room to break away if necessary. And once party unity starts to fracture during an active military confrontation, the president's leverage weakens on every front at once. Adversaries see it. Allies see it. Markets see it. The media sees it. Congress sees it. The president may still hold formal power, but practical control begins slipping. Then there is the legal dimension. A blockade is not a symbolic gesture. Under international law and American constitutional practice, it carries enormous significance. If Congress did not explicitly authorize military action of this scale, then serious questions emerge about war powers, executive authority, and the legality of the operation. That means the administration is not only fighting Iran and struggling with allies, it may also be heading into a domestic constitutional fight. And that kind of legal uncertainty is dangerous during an active conflict, because it raises the question of whether the president's strategy is not only failing, but vulnerable to being challenged as unlawful. Imagine how destabilizing that is. Allies see a president facing domestic legal scrutiny. Iran sees an opponent whose own institutions are divided. Financial markets see uncertainty layered on top of uncertainty. And ordinary Americans see rising costs without a clear explanation of what success even looks like anymore. Once the mission loses clarity, public tolerance drops quickly. And that brings us to the part of the story that matters most to viewers personally: the economic consequences. Foreign policy can feel distant until it arrives in everyday life, but if a major shipping lane like the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted, the effects ripple through the global economy almost immediately. Energy prices rise, shipping routes become longer and more expensive, insurance costs increase, delivery times stretch. Businesses pass costs to consumers, food prices climb, transportation gets more expensive, airline fares rise. Mortgage pressure grows if inflation expectations worsen. Retirement accounts suffer if markets keep falling. What starts as a military and diplomatic crisis eventually shows up at the gas station, at the grocery store, in the stock portfolio, and on the monthly bills. That is one reason this situation is so politically explosive. It is not confined to television screens or foreign policy briefings. It touches daily life. And when people start feeling the consequences personally, their patience for grand strategic promises runs out very quickly. They stop asking who sounded toughest in a speech and start asking who is making their lives more expensive. There are also long-term strategic costs that may be even harder to reverse. If European countries decide they can no longer depend on Washington for stability in moments like this, they begin building alternatives. If Asian economies diversify trade and energy arrangements to reduce dependence on American-backed routes, those shifts can become permanent. If Gulf states conclude they must manage regional tensions independently because Washington acts unpredictably, American influence shrinks, even if American military power remains enormous. This is how great powers lose centrality, not necessarily through one catastrophic defeat, but through repeated moments where partners quietly decide they need other options. That is why the image of the walkout matters so much. It is easy to dismiss a diplomatic walkout as symbolism, but symbolism in international politics often reveals deeper realities. For decades, American policymakers have operated with a basic expectation. When the United States acts, allies may complain, they may negotiate, they may drag their feet, but in the end, they largely fall in line. What the UN scene suggested is that this expectation can no longer be taken for granted. Countries are more willing to diverge, more willing to prioritize their own economic and political interests, more willing to let Washington stand alone if they believe it has misjudged the situation. And Iran, according to this narrative, saw that clearly. Iran did not have to win a propaganda war by making itself look beloved. It only had to make America look overextended, impatient, and increasingly alone. It only had to survive long enough for Washington's assumptions to weaken under the weight of reality. It only had to keep saying no while others started stepping away from the American position. So what happens next? Broadly speaking, there are three possible paths, and none of them offer a clean return to the optimism with which this strategy was launched. The first path is forced retreat. That would mean mounting pressure from Congress, military advisors, economic officials, and political allies eventually pushes the administration to back away from its maximal demands. The blockade would be eased or ended. The language of regime change would soften or disappear. The White House would declare victory in rhetorical terms, while quietly accepting a far more limited outcome than originally promised. This is often how political leaders try to escape a failing strategy, not by admitting defeat, but by redefining success. The problem is that the rest of the world usually sees the difference. If allies have already broken ranks and markets have already priced in the damage, the loss of credibility does not vanish just because a speech says otherwise. The second path is escalation. That is the most dangerous option. A leader who feels humiliated on the global stage may be tempted to prove strength through more dramatic military action. More strikes, more aggressive targets, more visible shows of force. The danger is that escalation can close off the very exits that still remain. It can transform a limited but ugly crisis into a regional war with far greater casualties, far higher costs, and even less international support. Once that happens, the president is no longer trying to salvage a strategy. He is trying to survive a war he expanded under pressure. The third path is prolonged drift. No full retreat, no dramatic escalation, just a grinding continuation of the current situation. Blockade pressure stays in place. Markets remain unstable. Shipping costs remain elevated. Allies keep drifting away. Iran keeps absorbing punishment without surrendering. Domestic frustration grows. This may actually be the most politically corrosive scenario because it normalizes dysfunction. It turns crisis into background noise while steadily weakening confidence in leadership, institutions, and alliances. Whichever path unfolds, one thing seems clear from the script you gave me. The real shock here is not simply that Iran rejected a ceasefire. The real shock is that America appeared unable to force movement either diplomatically or politically after betting everything on the idea that force alone would be enough. Trump wanted a demonstration of overwhelming control. Instead, the world saw the limits of pressure without consensus, aggression without strategy, and power without alignment. And that is the larger lesson buried inside this whole story. In a multipolar world, no country, not even the United States, gets to assume that threats automatically create obedience. Military strength still matters. Economic power still matters. But so do legitimacy, trust, alliances, and the ability to build support rather than simply demand it. If a leader ignores those things, even a show of force can turn into a show of isolation. By the time the cameras captured those empty chairs at the United Nations, the damage was already deeper than one speech. Those empty chairs represented fraying trust. They represented exhausted allies. They represented the failure of a strategy that promised speed and delivered uncertainty. They represented a moment when the most powerful country in the world found itself speaking, and much of the room decided it no longer had to listen. And that may be the most dangerous part of all. Because once allies begin acting as if they have other options, once markets begin treating American leadership as a source of instability, once adversaries begin calculating that Washington can be waited out, the issue is no longer just one conflict with Iran. The issue becomes whether the architecture of American influence itself is beginning to change. Right now, the White House may still speak the language of confidence. It may still describe the operation as necessary, controlled, and ultimately successful. But words have to compete with images, and the image the world saw was unforgettable. Diplomats walking out, allies pulling away, Iran refusing to bend, and Washington looking less like the conductor of the crisis than one more actor trapped inside it. So the biggest question is no longer whether Trump can deliver the victory he promised in 72 hours. That timeline is gone. The bigger question now is whether he can find any path out of this that does not leave America weaker, more divided, and less trusted than before. Because in conflicts like this, losing control rarely happens in one dramatic instant. It happens in stages. First, the timetable slips. Then the allies hesitate. Then the markets react. Then the legal questions grow. Then the political coalition fractures. Then the world watches a room empty out while you are still talking. And by the time you realize what that means, the crisis is no longer arriving. It is already here. That is where this story stands. A president who promised dominance is facing resistance from Iran, skepticism from allies, anxiety in financial markets, questions from Congress, and political risk at home. A strategy designed to force surrender has instead created a test of endurance. A campaign meant to display American power has opened a global debate about American limits. And the next moves, whether they come from Washington, Tehran, European capitals, or Congress, may determine whether this becomes a temporary humiliation or the beginning of a much larger shift in how power works in the world. Because Iran's rejection was not just a rejection of ceasefire terms. It was a rejection of the assumption that pressure alone would decide the future. The UN walkout was not just a protest. It was a signal that support can no longer be presumed. And the crisis now unfolding is not just about one blockade, one negotiation, or one president's promise. It is about whether a system built on American leadership can survive a moment when leadership itself appears fractured, impatient, and increasingly alone. If the administration finds a path back from the edge, it may still limit the damage. If it chooses pride over strategy, the damage could deepen fast. But either way, the illusion of easy control is gone. The world has seen too much. The allies have signaled too much. The markets have reacted too sharply. And Iran, at least for now, has made its position unmistakably clear. It is not backing down. The question is whether Washington knows how to step back before this crisis grows into something even bigger than the one it already is.